Our program this evening, very apropos because we're into the gardening weather now and beautiful days of spring. And it's getting to the source of our native plants, does provenance matter? I think all of us here at the Nature Club understand the importance of native plants for landscaping and gardening and the importance of native plants in ecology in general. But what exactly is a native? And what is it we want to look for, and what is it we want to avoid when looking for native plants for our landscaping and gardening? Dr. Duran is going to be talking about that tonight. It's going to be a fascinating and eye-opening view of how we can affect the environment in a positive way and may be affecting the environment in a less than positive way inadvertently, and to avoid that. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Duran back with us. It's become an annual event to have Dan at the Nature Club, and it's one of the...
I love being here.
We love having you.
Yeah, I love you all. No, actually, this is really great because in the meeting we've heard about all these different things that are going on, and a lot of them are happening at Scotland Run Park, which I appreciate so much. Our relationship, the Nature Center, and the Gloucester County Nature Club has been super strong, and I really think it's awesome. So again, thank you for everything that you do, and hopefully you'll come out to these events as much as possible. I got to actually finally go on some bird walks. Yeah, with Marilyn and Marie. Last year I got to do a couple, and I mean, it was awesome, of course, as you would imagine. So hopefully you'll get to do some of that as well. And yeah, today I'm going to talk to you about whether it matters where your plants come from. I mean, of course, we could say this is a native species. This is a Asclepias tuberosa. It's a butterfly weed, right? But does that mean that it's native, or is it just kind of native? And so this is a complicated topic, and I apologize that the material is kind of complicated. I tried to make it as not complicated as I possibly can, but feel free to totally say, hey, wait a minute, what are you even talking about right now? And stop me and ask questions. My friend and colleague, Doug Tallamy, when I told him I was making this talk, he said, oh God, are you going to make it harder for people to get native plants? I'm like, no, that's not my intent here. But I understand that he was concerned about that, because he's like, oh no, you get people interested in things, and then they get this idea, and then I'm like, all right, fine. So I'm trying very hard not to do that. So yeah, there is genetic diversity in plants, right? Whether it be native or not. And so I want to talk to you about genetic diversity and how this gets distributed throughout the geographic range of a plant. We'll talk about problems that happen when you have too little genetic diversity, right? I think most people know that's a problem because we've all heard about inbreeding, whether it be, plants or animals or maybe people or whatever. Just we've all heard about this, right? So not having a lot of genetic diversity can be a real problem. Too much genetic diversity can actually be a problem. Most people don't ever talk about that. So that's something that I will introduce that I think will be a little surprising. And then the big question, and I got some people really, really happy and really, really mad at me, depending who they were. And I gave this talk in front of 500 people at a native plants conference that was like a big conference in Pennsylvania. And I had some people who were not happy with me for some of the things that I said. But I'm a scientist and I just call it like it is, right? So we'll see what we think. And I'm going to tell you, unfortunately, there is no easy answer. So am I going to say cultivars bad? No, I'm not. Am I going to say cultivars good? I'm not going to say that either. So we're going to have to think about it. We're going to have to come up with some sort of general guidelines. You say, well, this would be a better choice maybe in this circumstance, right? All right, so first of all, what tree is this? Yep, American persimmon, absolutely. Diospyros virginiana, right? This is a tree that occurs throughout a large section of the southeastern United States, all the way up into South Jersey and up into parts of North Jersey too. And when you see a range map like this, it looks like they're found pretty much everywhere in that contained area, and that's not true, right? You don't find persimmons in every single place that you could go in Tennessee. You won't find persimmons every single place that you go in Arkansas. But they're broadly distributed there, and so what you really realize is that plants aren't contiguous. They're actually kind of clumpy, right? They're almost always. There are some things that maybe are almost contiguous, but most things are clumpy, and so you can get to something that we could call a population, right? Where you have a bunch of individuals that are all kind of in the same area. You know how you've been to places where there's like several clusters of persimmons, and then you can go miles and miles and not see a persimmon, right? So when you get into a place where you see a population of a plant, how do you know how many individuals are in that population? Any ideas or opinions or anything? What do you think? How would you know how many individuals are in that population?
Estimate.
Okay, estimate, sure. And how much do that? You're right. You're probably going to have to estimate because it's hard to count everything. You could take a small area, count that, and then try to extrapolate out from that. But here's the thing: what's an individual? Okay, so I know that sounds weird, but there's genetic individuals and there's physical, corporal being individuals, right? We call them ramets and genets. Genets are genetic individuals, and all of these daisies in this one particular area may end up being one single genetic individual, even though they're units that look like they're separate individuals. So what is a population size? It really depends on what you're talking about, right? So this here is a famous forest. In fact, it has a name. It's called Pando. And it's not just a forest, it's a single tree. It's a single tree that has 40,000 stems. But it's all one giant root system underground, all connected. The whole thing is one tree. And so what is the population here? It's one, right? But that's hard to tell sometimes, right? So
Where is that?
that is found in Utah, in Fish Lake National Wildlife Refuge in north central Utah. I actually went up to it to see it and photograph it, and there was no sign. There's nothing. There's a sign that says boat ramp, and there's all these different signs. There's nothing saying. This is arguably the largest organism in the world. By one definition, it means the largest organism in the entire world, and yet there isn't even a sign or anything. But it's really obvious when you're driving up to it because there are no aspens anywhere for hundreds of miles around, and then there's this giant aspen grove, so it's pretty cool. Anyway, so species really is not just everywhere, it's a collection of populations. Sometimes those populations only have one or a couple individuals, and sometimes they can have hundreds or thousands or millions, depending on what the species is. Now, naturally, plant populations possess usually some amount of genetic variation. Everybody's not usually the same. Once in a while you see something like that, but that's remarkable. And we can say that if populations are genetically differentiated from each other, they're somewhat genetically different in different geographic areas, we could say that the species has strong population structure, is what we would say, right? So maybe ones from Utah of this aspen are different than ones from, Wyoming or whatever. And alternatively, if populations don't have any substantial differentiation, we could say that they are panmictic, right? There's a cool word for you, right? Panmictic just means that the genes are all mixed up. They don't seem to be segregated into different geographic areas. They don't care, right? So there's your 75-cent word for the day, panmictic. Now, I'm going to graphically show you how this could be, right? So let's say we have 5 different genetic copies here. We've got A, we're just going to call them A, B, C, D, E, and F, or I guess just E, there's no F. Doing really good as a professor here. Anyway, in this particular example here, you can see that many genes are found only in specific geographic areas, right? Like, you've got, A's are only found one little area down here in the southeast. D's are found in the mid-Atlantic. You've got this different thing. So you look at this and you say, all right, there's clearly some kind of geographic rhyme or reason to what's going on. Whereas in this particular example here, this would be panmixia, where you have no more different genetic variants. It's the same amount of different genetic types, but they're all mixed up, right? So this is not, you can still have genetic variation, it's just whether it's mixed up or whether it tends to be clustered into different areas. Now, why do some species have a great deal of population structure? Things like, what do we got here? Trillium, right? Everybody loves trilliums. Trilliums have tons of population structure. And other things like milkweeds have none. So it depends. Actually, that's not true. Some milkweeds do. But most milkweeds have very low, especially common milkweed, right? And so why is that true? So your milkweeds are kind of already all mixed up. So if you move a milkweed from Pennsylvania to here, it's a common milkweed, it probably doesn't make any difference at all. If you move a butterfly weed from California to here, that's right there in Southern California, it might, I don't know, from somewhere else in New Jersey, it probably doesn't matter that much. So it's one of those things, we're going to talk about this a lot more. But first of all, why is that the case? Why do some things have all this geographic population structure and other things don't? It all has to do with barriers to movement. So if things move along the edges of roads, they get all mixed up, doesn't matter. Things like trilliums don't move very much at all, and we're going to talk about why that is. And so things that can disperse a lot to get their seeds out, to get their pollen out, those are things that are going to end up probably having a lot less population structure, and it probably doesn't matter as much where they come from. So I'm going to kind of explain a couple of ways that you can get some genetic differentiation where things will become genetically different in different places. Let's imagine that we've got this little map here just shows the topography. So these are mountains, right? Topography of eastern North America, and let's say we've got some population of some random plant, and it lives on the coastal plain, and it lives in the Carolinas up to Delmarva, and let's say that this thing has been here for 110,000 years on the coastal plain, and then one year this amazing event happened, and a bird got a seed stuck in its claws, and it flew all the way across the mountains here and ended up landing somewhere in western Kentucky. And the seed was perfectly viable, and it got into the right kind of substrate, and it grew, and then all of a sudden you got a new population of them. So this is what we call a sweepstakes event. This doesn't happen very often, right? This is a lottery ticket. It's good. But let's say this happened, 110,000 years ago, and now you've got this thing on both sides of the mountains. Well, guess what? They're not going to be exchanging genes very often. They're not going to be interbreeding with each other because they're so unlikely to ever come back in contact. So given time, these isolated populations are going to become genetically different, right? They may end up eventually becoming a new species, but that could take a long time. It could take tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years, right? But when they start to become genetically different, sometimes you can tell by looking at them, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's just not been long enough to be able to tell. But it doesn't have to be just because things become super isolated geographically from each other. They could be because of differences in the environment, even on relatively small scale. So if we look at New Jersey here, right, we've got 4 different major geological areas we call physiographic provinces in the state, and we are in the coastal plain, right? Now, let's say you had a population of some sort of a milkweed, and it lives in the coastal plain. It could get to the Piedmont. There's no problem dispersing to the Piedmont. It's right there, right? But maybe the soil is just too different, and its seeds don't like to take in that soil. But give time, somebody gets a mutation, something can happen, they could end up adapting to that new soil type that they were not used to, and so they could become genetically different as well. So it could be either because things get separated from each other or because they evolve to change a little bit. And this is a real example. So what do we have here? What plant is this? Swamp milkweed, yep. There are 2 subspecies of swamp milkweed in our area. In the Piedmont, going through into Pennsylvania, we have Asclepius, I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden here. It'll come to me in a second. Incarnata, thank you. Incarnata. For some reason, I couldn't come up with it. And then in the coastal plain, it's Asclepius incarnata pulchra. And they're not exactly the same. Now, if you buy swamp milkweeds, and you get them online, they're almost certainly incarnata. They are not likely the South Jersey form. They may actually end up being, I'm working with somebody right now who believes they may actually be separate species. They're very closely related, but they may actually be more appropriately separate species. But either way, swamp milkweed, you buy it online, you're not probably getting pulchra ones, right, if you get that. So if you wanted ones that are sort of the native type to South Jersey, you would want to make sure you got them from seeds that were collected in South Jersey. Otherwise, you're not going to get that. There's all kinds of different barriers, whether they be mountain ranges or different types of soil or whatever. And humans have actually created and removed barriers at the same time. We've created barriers for species that live, let's say you live in a forest and you're a species that has seeds that can move, a couple miles away. Well, there's a giant city in the way there now, right? So we've created all these new barriers by mowing everything down and putting concrete and all of this. We also have removed barriers too, because then we homogenize things by making roads which connect areas and create all kinds of these habitats for things like different kinds of milkweeds. So we've really changed things up. The bottom line is we've made it harder and easier for some things to move depending on what your lifestyle is as a plant, depending on what your natural history is. We may have mixed you up more or mixed you up even less. Now, power line right-of-ways are really amazing dispersal corridors for a lot of our native plants, right? And in fact, there's at least a few plants that my friend Jason Sepke and I argue probably evolved in power lines because we can't find them anywhere else at this point, right? So it's just like, we know they love these areas because they get kept at this early stage of succession because they're mowed, and because they're long, you know, and they connect these different habitats, often you do find species kind of that move along them. It's kind of neat. Okay, so we don't know the population genetics. We've never studied the genetics of most types of plants. Very few plants have ever been studied. So when people say to me, oh, does this particular plant have a lot of population structure, or is it more panmictic? I don't know, but we can come up with some sort of guidelines to say, well, it's probably likely to be more like this. And so the two questions that I would ask are, how does the pollen move, and how do the fruits and the seeds move, right? These are the two factors to likely tell us something about the contemporary mixing of genetic types that go on, right? So let's take an example here. Loblolly pines have pollen grains that can travel hundreds of miles, like up to 1,500 miles via wind, okay? So there's no barrier to stop loblolly pine pollen from getting from one end of the range of that species to the other end. It just blows all over the place, right? Incredibly airborne, right? And then looking at more at the fruits and seeds, something like a tick seed, right? They have seeds that can travel long distances via fur or feathers or socks or backpacks or in my case insect nets. You know, they get stuck on. You can go as far as you drive your car, and before you realize, oh no, I got these on my pants, and then you're in another state. You know, so these things can move really far. So if we're thinking about pollen, I want to remind you a little bit about how pollination works. Real simple breakdown of how pollination works. And it matters because depending on how pollination happens, it really changes how much genetic variation and how it gets mixed up. So we're not going to get through all this, but the whole point is that there are parts that make pollen and there are parts that receive pollen. And ultimately, when there is pollen that gets into the parts that receive pollen, it will fertilize these eggs and they will become seeds and they will get a fruit that develops around them. Now plants may be able to use their own pollen to fertilize their eggs. We can say that they're selfing or self-compatible if they can do that, right? You can't be more inbred than having offspring with yourself, right? That is the maximum inbreeding possible. So you're going to have low genetic diversity. This is not ideal. Plants often do this as like a last-ditch resort, but they would rather have their pollen get somewhere else and get somebody else's pollen on them. Generally, they would like some mixing. So actually, some plants are self-incompatible. They won't even allow it. They can't even pollinate themselves, right? But very commonly, plant pollination is caused by insects or wind moving pollen from one plant to another. Very often it's insects. About 90% of the time it's insects. So that increases the genetic variation and mixes things up a lot more, right? Also, I just want to say one real quick thing here as an ecologist. Insects are not trying to pollinate flowers. They don't care. They're not interested in helping flowers. Everybody has this thing, oh, this is beautiful mutualism. And they are interested in getting nectar. That is their deal, right? In the process, they are forced to pick up pollen and transmit it. They're not trying to do that, right? I've heard people say that. They're like, oh, the insects are trying to pollinate. Like, they don't care about the pollen. Now, some of them do because they want to eat the pollen, right? So, and it benefits them for the plants to do well because then they do well. But a cynical ecologist has called a mutualism a reciprocal parasitism, right? Everybody gets what they need from the other side, and then it keeps working because everybody's happy. So. Anyway, I just wanted to say that real quick. So we've got some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful trilliums, right? Who doesn't love trilliums? And so I want to talk about them as our example of a lot of population structure, right? So we know the slow-growing flowering plants are found in wooded areas. They take up to 8 years, which is a really long time to get full maturity. There's not a lot of places that sell them, I don't think. I know there's a couple of places. But anyway, they are sometimes self-compatible, but they don't do very well unless they are bred with another plant, unless they're outcrossed. And it appears as if pollination is often performed by certain insects. In fact, the deal is this. So, like I said, remember mutualism isn't really everybody's trying to help everybody else. They're cheating on the insects badly here, right? I don't know if you know this, but trilliums create a smell, some of them, including erectum, create a smell, they call them stinking Benjamin, that smells like a dead animal. It smells like rotting meat. And it attracts these flesh flies that think they're about to find a dead animal and lay their eggs on it. They never find it, but they go all in and out of here trying to find it, and they get the pollen, and they move it, so they pollinate the plants, they get nothing in return, right? So it's not a mutualism at all. It's totally cheating by the plant. Kind of interesting. So here's another trillium, right? And this one has little tiny shirt-winged flower beetles in it, right? This is a little bit more of a true mutualism. They get nectar, they move the pollen, it works out. By the way, I think they're beautiful things. I think, well, of course, I think insects are beautiful, right? So, I mean, I'm not normal here. I'm a little biased. I do study insects for a living, but I think they're really beautiful. Anyway, so that's a little bit about how the pollen's moving. It's being moved by insects. Probably insects that don't go a super far distance, but they're at least moving it a bit, right? Now, what goes on with the fruits and the seeds? Well, the seeds are contained within these fruits that have these structures called eliosomes, and these are basically fatty, fake insects that they create. It's really neat. The fruit, if you take away that skin, inside there is this really fatty, grub-like stuff. It's got a lot of protein, got a lot of fat in it, and insects love to eat them. Love to eat them. So ants and yellow jackets and other things will get in there. So here's a couple of pictures of some that have been broken open. You can see some yellow jackets, and there's some Phoenicigaster ants, and here's a harvestman. And they're all trying to get at that. They don't care about the seeds. They want the fatty stuff, right? So there were a couple of studies that found that it actually matters which insects eat the eliosomes, because they totally change the way that the plant genetic structure works. It's kind of cool. So they did this study, and they found that ants like Phoenicigaster and Myrmica, which are two major genera of ants, were attracted to fruits that had most of their eliosomes there. And what they would do is they would grab them and they would take them back to their nest, right? They would take them just as if they had caught prey and were taking them back to their nest, right? And that happened about 15% of the time. The rest of them, 85%, were seeds were left near the mother plant, had no eliosomes because they got completely devoured by ground beetles, nocturnal ground beetles, which are running around at night, and they would find the fruit, and they would actually go into a kill mode, which is amazing, because again, they don't realize it's not an insect. They would bite it and try to cut it in half and then eat the parts real quick. So it's kind of neat. But yeah, so anyway, the whole thing is there's a different effect on the genetics depending on who eats the fruits. The fruits fed upon by ants resulted in longer dispersal of seeds and more genetic mixing, because they would take these seeds away from these mother plants and take them all to their nest. Eventually that nest gets abandoned, they start a new nest somewhere else, and all those seeds from different plants or pulled from different areas are all going to mix together, right? Whereas with the beetles, there was a lot less mixing, because they would just eat them right next to the plant, drop the seed, don't care, right? Because they don't eat the seeds, they just eat the fleshy parts. So anyway, this is just to show you how it's really cool, because the natural history of different insects can totally affect the genetic population structure of a plant. It's kind of cool. Okay, so given that pollinators are likely to stay in a relatively local area, and the fruits and seeds are not going to move very far, even with the ants, they're not moving more than probably 50, 100 feet, we might expect a fairly large amount of population structure. They're probably going to be really stuck in their different geographic areas. And it turns out that that's true. So there were a couple studies of the Trillium pusillum complex, and they found that, like, you know, every couple dozen miles you get a different variety, and most of these were genetically at least somewhat different. And so anyway, if you were interested in planting Trillium pusillum, and then you got it from a store and it just said Trillium pusillum, you didn't know where it came from, you know, you might be getting something that's actually relatively different. You know, what would really be the issue is if you lived in South Carolina and you got one from like Arkansas and then you planted it right next to other ones. That would be where it actually kind of matters. I realize this is the exception. So again, I'm just putting it all out there, right? So we'll kind of do the take-homes at the end. Okay, so too little genetic diversity. We all get it. It can be a bad thing, right? Here's my friend, Dr. Mandel. We did our PhDs together at Vanderbilt. She was studying the giant world sunflower while I was studying tiger beetles. And she actually rediscovered it. It was believed to be extinct in the early 1900s. It's a really cool plant. It's very, very, very rare. And she discovered a couple more populations. They're only known from western Tennessee and right on the border of Alabama and Georgia. Population sizes are really, really small. The census population sizes, they range from 24 individuals to a few hundred. And these two sets of populations are pretty far from each other, and there's no way that there's any genetic exchange going on between those two sets of populations, at least not at this point. Maybe at one point, right, but not anymore. So two of the populations, the ones that are shown in red, are so tiny they only had about 20 genetic individuals. They actually had hundreds of individuals, but they only had about 20 genetic individuals, right? So very, very, very low fitness. They're basically so inbred they can't even produce viable seeds. So really bad, right? And the larger Tennessee population here had about 60 individuals, and the larger Alabama one had several hundred genetic individuals, right? So everybody but the big Alabama one had signs of inbreeding depression, meaning that they were having serious genetic consequences from being so small. And so they thought, hey, we could do something cool here. We could do something called genetic rescue. So if you mix the ones from Alabama with the ones from Tennessee, you might get seeds that are really good, because at least you're getting a little bit of genetic variation infused into there, right? And the whole take home of this is just saying that when you mix them, so these are the pure Alabama ones, these are pure Tennessee ones, the ones that are mixed are doing better overall than the ones that were from pure Tennessee. And so, yeah, maybe it works, right? I talked to somebody once about potentially doing genetic rescue of a really rare milkweed in New Jersey that's only got a couple of populations left, Asclepias lanceolata, seeing if I can get permission to do this. That's the hard thing. They are probably, a couple of these populations are probably so low there's no chance of them ever producing. They're basically standing dead. I mean, they're walking dead. They're there, but they're not likely to ever produce any viable offspring again. So without genetic rescue, we're just going to watch them go away. And so I thought maybe taking ones from Delmarva and doing some breeding would matter. The plants are unaware of political lines. So these ones here don't care that, like, technically this is Delaware and this is South Jersey. These are closer to these than they are to the ones up there. You know, they don't know about Delaware or New Jersey. They're completely unaware of that. So it seemed like a biologically reasonable thing to do. We'll see if it happens. But somebody said, why don't you take them from North Carolina? There's a whole bunch of them in North Carolina. Or take them from northern Florida. There's a ton of them in northern Florida. And I'm like, well, see, that's the thing. They might be locally adapted to different winters and things here. I don't know if I really want to mix that. At least here, they're really close to each other. You know? So again, does it matter where things come from? Probably. To some degree. Okay, so what about too much genetic diversity? That seems like a weird issue. The other side of the coin here is when you have really strong adaptation to an area, and you're so adapted that any genetic exchange is worse than what you currently have, right? This happens in plants, it rarely happens in animals. Plants can sometimes handle a whole lot of inbreeding, and sometimes if they get lucky, inbreeding stops being bad. There's a whole process to this. If you get lucky, you get through this evolutionary bottleneck thing, you can actually get to a point where sometimes it's okay to be inbred. But, so it does happen this way. This is a Stephanemeria plant, Stephanemeria maleurensis. There's different members of the genus. And this one particular species of Stephanemeria is only found on one hillside in one mountain in one county in Oregon, and that's it. And apparently they're so perfectly adapted to the exact soil conditions and temperature and rainfall patterns that happen in this one place in Malheur County that anything else is worse. They're just perfect for that environment. So if they get mixed with any other populations, they actually have too much variation. It's actually bad for them. So milkweeds, let's go to another example here. Let's go to milkweeds. We would imagine that milkweeds probably are not particularly strongly genetically structured because they're all over the place, right? They're all over the place. They move. They're around roads. You know, we wouldn't think that they would be particularly. Their flowers are pollinated by strong flying insects that can move long distances, right? Their seeds are literally flying. Their seeds get out on tufts of floss and they go really far, right? So, but there might be some genetic structure for some species of milkweeds. So I tried to see if I could find any where there was population structure, and I was actually surprised to find butterfly milkweed actually has substantial population structure. So this kind of, common milkweed does not, but this one does. I'm not going to make you read all this. I'm just going to hit the high point, which is pollination experiments performed on butterfly milkweed showed greater success when plants within a population were crossed with each other than plants from different populations. So apparently they get really locally adapted. Even something like 20 miles, or 20 kilometers was enough that there was some population structure. That's nothing, right? So that's kind of surprising. So yeah, so they have kind of the opposite, which is outbreed depression. If you mix them up too much, if you take ones from, you know, like Michigan or something, and you mix them with ones here, they may not do as well. Okay, and so the last thing, and then I'll try to tie all this together, is cultivars, right? Cultivars are a really important thing, and I know a lot of people have opinions, and I understand that. And so, you know, sometimes people say to me, is a cultivar native? I know someone who came up with the term nativar, you know, cultivar of native plants, and it sounds good. Well, first of all, it sounds better if you say nativar, because then people are probably more likely to buy it. He's very smart. So anyway, but what's going on with cultivars? So are they native? Well, cultivars are plants that are selectively bred for one or more desirable traits we like. It's got a longer flowering time. It's got bluer fruits. It's got flowers that or have bigger petals or whatever, something that we like, right? These may be related to the overall shape of the plant, the flower color, the shape, or especially leaf characteristics. We love to make plants that are purple. We just love to make plants that are purple. So many cultivars of wild plants, instead of being green, they're purple. Viburnum dentatum here, right, which is arrowwood viburnum. This is called blue muffin. It's absolutely beautiful, right? I get it. I totally get why somebody would want this. So the question is, how do these function ecologically? Are they the same? Are they similar? And what are they going to do to the genetic diversity that we're talking about? So those are two questions that we would want to ask. And so it really depends, you know, what are these going to do to things that try to feed on them? And a large part of the reason why we plant native plants is to attract native insects that would feed on them. So it depends on what's being selected for. So this Eastern ninebark, purple variety of Eastern ninebark, Physocarpus oculifolius, Diablo cultivar, is marketed as having improved disease resistance. Basically what it means is it's no longer food. They no longer get this particular beetle, calligrapha beetle, does not live on it anymore, and that kind of defeats the whole purpose. So I cannot recommend that cultivar of Eastern ninebark. I can kind of unequivocally say, if you can't bring in the beetles that feed on it, that the birds feed on, everybody else feeds on. By the way, that's the disease. This beautiful animal here is the disease. They don't even do that much damage. They just put some holes in the leaves, and so people don't want to see any holes. They want to see no blemishes. They want to see, you know. And so I'm like, well, then, again, why are we doing a native plant here if we're going to try to get rid of these things? So I would say, in general, if you change the leaf texture or color, which means the chemistry of it, it's probably going to make it less palatable to herbivores like caterpillars and things like that. If you're just changing the flowering color or time, probably doesn't matter as much, right? Probably doesn't matter as much. There's some research that Doug Talany's student did that said that cultivars of a lot of flowers, the flowers were not less attractive. There are exceptions. There were ones where they were way less attractive to pollinators, but it just depends. But I can say anything where you make the plant go from a green color and having a certain texture to having this like rough texture and being purple probably makes them not food anymore, because you change the leaf chemistry so much. And again, that happened here, right? They did that, and it no longer attracts the beetle that I would want to attract. The whole reason I would plant this is to get that beetle. So anyway, so what about exchanging genes? What about genetic interaction between the cultivars and the wild plants, right? You know, again, I'm just going hypotheticals here for some of this stuff. I'm not saying that you're going to have this massive problem. I'm just bringing up potential things to think about. You know, if you live in an area that's got, you know, a lot of woods around it. I just picked I have no idea where this is. It's a random screenshot from Google Earth. I don't even think this is New Jersey. Anyway, if you have woods behind your house, and let's say you lived in a place, probably not in South Jersey, but maybe somewhere in northeastern Pennsylvania, and you were lucky enough you had Trillium in your yard, right? And maybe you had Trillium grandiflora, right? And you would want to make sure that if you got some to augment what you had, maybe you bought some from a nursery, that you would know where they came from. You probably could, I mean, you could potentially. Here is an actual example that a former student of mine sent me a few years ago. She was interested in, this plant here, Persicaria virginiana. It was all over her backyard. She liked it. What's the common name for this again?
Jump seed.
Jump seed, thank you. And so, I just couldn't think of it for a second. But anyway, she had this plant all over the place in her backyard, and somebody gave her this, admittedly beautiful, painter's palette variety cultivar of Persicaria virginiana. It's got variegated leaves, it's got bright fuchsia fruits on it. I mean, it is beautiful, there's no question. But she had the wild stuff and this stuff in the same place. So this happened. And so you can see over time how this starts to change. There would be a jump, it's called jump seed, there would be a seed that would end up in an area and it would start to spread into wild areas. And so now all of a sudden there's these cultivars that are taking over the woods. I'm not saying it's going to end the world. I don't know how bad this is going to be. This is from, well, I guess it's been a little while now. 2014, I'm like, it's a few years ago. I guess it's been like 9 years. But I should check back in and see how that's going. But yeah, you can see how that moves around. So I have a question too. How much genetic variation is present within these cultivars to begin with? So if you buy inkberry holly at like Lowe's or Home Depot or anything like that, you are going to get something that is effectively a clone. There's like no genetic variation in any of that stuff that's going around, right? This could be a concern for a couple of reasons. I mean, I'm saying none. Like, I think they are all clonable, actually. So we kind of did this before in the, I think it was the 50s, the Big Mike or the Gros Michel, the one species, the cultivar of banana that was all over the place, went completely extinct and stopped being in the market altogether. Now we have only Cavendish, pretty much. It's the only kind of banana you can buy. They all look the same. And because there was no genetic variation, it got a disease that killed all the bananas. And then what did we do? Let's just do the same thing again and plant all Cavendish now. So I find this to be amazing. We don't seem to learn very well from things. So anyway, I worry about this happening with something like an inkberry holly, where it would be nice to have a little bit of infusion of genetics, maybe a little bit. Okay, so summary. We said a lot of things, right? I know, I'm sorry. Like I said, when I talked to Doug about this, I'm like, there's a lot of stuff here and I have to make population genetics accessible. So we'll do the best we can. But so some basic things that we could say is the species sometimes is different in different genetic areas, right? It can have population structure, as we say, right? They're not always genetically the same everywhere. That's a true thing. This can be the result of their ability to disperse, how well that they can move their seeds around and their pollen and stuff like that. Sometimes barriers and distance can isolate things. And sometimes it's because they're adapted to different conditions that they're genetically different. Small isolated populations may experience inbreeding depression. If you're too small, if you get too isolated, that can be bad. But if you have too much mixing and you're really mixing stuff that's from far away, that can be bad too. So you want a little bit of genetic variation, you just don't want absolutely too much. So cultivars are selected for traits desirable to humans. Often these changes will have little impact on their ecological function. Full disclosure, 90% of my native plants that have gone to my yard in the last year or so are straight species. They're not cultivars. 10% of them are. And I really like some of these cultivars, and there's ones where I say, I'm not going to use that cultivar, but this is pretty close to the wild type, and I think it's probably pretty good. I don't have a study of every single species, and I can't know. But there are at least a few things where it's actually really hard to get a straight species in the native plant trade. So, I mean, I'm kind of go with what I talked about with Doug, which is, you know, maybe lesser evil, lesser of two evils, right? Is having something that's a cultivar, but it's not exactly native, but it's better than doing something that's like, you know, Bradford pear, you know, for sure, right? I think we all know that one's terrible, right? So, you know, there's potential for genetic exchange, we call it gene flow, between different populations of plants. We don't know what that's going to do. So basically, when you're buying or taking a native plant species, it will be best if the source was from the same general ecoregion of the one you're planting, right? So if you have a choice and you can get a butterfly weed from South Jersey, Virginia, or Iowa, don't go with Iowa. Probably don't go with Virginia. I would stick with South Jersey. I'm not saying if you do a Virginia one that you're going to wipe out something, but just try to make better decisions. That's all, you know. Yeah. So there's the summary of the summary. Try to use plants from general area. Okay? Try. Do the best you can. There's a Xerces Society ecoregion map if you'd like to look at that. That can give you some guidance, right? They don't have to be from the exact county you live in. Some genetic version is good. Cultivars are complicated. You know, it's very complicated. I don't choose anything where the leaf color has changed. That's my thing. Okay? And if species are as widespread or found in your area, then using cultivars of that species may actually do something. So if a species is widespread, try to get the wild type. Yeah?
Could you repeat what you said about you don't choose anything if the leaf color does what?
The leaf color is different. So if you get something and the plant is normally green, but there's a cultivar and the leaves are red or purpley, I generally avoid those because my main reason for having native plants is to attract caterpillars. And caterpillars are very often going to not want to eat the plant if it's the leaves are so chemically changed that they're now purple. They're probably not even going to recognize it as food. So I just try to keep it to like changing flower color or changing flowering time or whatever, like length, whatever, that's fine, you know. But for me, my personal advice is I try to keep things where the cultivar does not have a different leaf color. So, yeah, and that's what I got for you. So I'll take some questions.
So if you go to a place like Triple Oaks, because they have a lot of native plants, if or places like that, or you know, and other places, if you tell them you want a straight species, are they going to know what you're talking about?
I hope. It really depends on who you're talking to. I mean, there's places where that would be, where they're going to look at you like you're crazy, and other places where they know what that means. I've regularly asked different growers, what is the provenance of your plants? And they're like, oh, we grow them in South Jersey. I'm like, no. Where did you get your genetic stock from? Oh, I have no idea. And I'm like, okay, see, that's concerning to me. You know, so you can ask these questions. When people ask them more, they're going to get more used to having to come up with an answer for that. So I think it's a good thing to have that conversation. And, you know, if they say, what's a straight species, say, you know, just not a cultivated variety of it, but what the plant looks like in the wild. And, you know, a lot of growers are not going to have any idea what, you know, they just like, well, we get this from a place in, you know, the Midwest, and then we grow it here, and, you know, who knows. But I just, like I said, and like I said to Doug, I'm like, I'm not trying to make it too difficult. I'm just trying to introduce some reality, and like, we have to talk about the science of this, and I think it's important, you know? So, yes?
From places like Home Depot, like that, you have no idea where
No idea, absolutely not at all, yeah.
So you shouldn't buy it there?
Well, okay, so that's a great question. Okay, so when I lived in Pennsylvania, and I lived in the Piedmont, and there were no tea berries because it's the Piedmont. I like tea berries a lot, and I had some area where the soil was amended and I could grow them. They actually sell tea berries at Home Depot or Lowe's or one of those places now. And it had a label, it said native plant. I was actually really blown away by that. And it was like a professional label. It wasn't like something the store put on there. It was like somebody sat in a room and approved this, you know, and I was like, oh, that's great. I mean, it's a great idea that they're doing this. I think it's a really great thing. I have no idea where it came from. Probably came from like, you know, Michigan or something like that. But where I was, it wouldn't make any difference, you know. So, but some things, you know, it might matter more. It's just, like I said, you just want to think about sort of the general principles I mentioned. But it's true, if you get something from Home Depot or Lowe's, there's no way you're ever finding out what the provenance of that plant was. It'll just never happen.
You can't ask anybody there.
But they don't know. If you ask the corporate headquarters, they probably don't even know. There's like 2 people. It'll take you like a week to figure out who was even the right person to talk to. Right.
So are you studying the different types of bugs that should be in our environment and reduction of a certain population, maybe introduce plants to bring that beneficial bug back to our environment, like bees?
Yeah. I mean,
Butterflies.
that's a really important thing is again, having the plants that do support the insects, which then support the birds and everything else too. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Me personally, this is funny enough, this is not my study system, but I do have a background in population genetics. So I work mostly on insects, but this all translates. It works. You can just translate it from insects to plants, and it's pretty much the same thing. Although we don't really have cultivars of insects, but not yet. Yes?
Are blister beetles really that detrimental to the solitary bee population?
Probably not. Blister beetles have always been here. And all the blister beetles that you're going to find in South Jersey, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's any exceptions, are native. And I mean, they're part of the ecosystem. They do hit, they cycle. They do hit solitary bees. They absolutely do. But you know, they're a parasitoid, but I leave them alone personally.
The plant they eat, is that the yellow flower called Calicium? Is it something like that?
There's many different blister beetles here, and many of them are on members of the Rosaceae. And I don't.
It's a yellow flower.
Yeah, I don't know which one. I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but there might be one that's on that. Sure.
They eat the flower of the wheat.
Oh, okay.
I said, do they eat the flower?
Oh, they should be eating the flower. Yeah.
So if you have the lantern flies that seem to decimate some of our plants, is there anything, what studies are trying to control that? Because that's not indigenous.
Yeah, so if I had an answer for that, I would be a billionaire. I wish I had an answer for that. What I can tell you though, you said what studies? There are some being done right now on biological control. So the idea is, what is a parasite of it, where it's from, and whenever you try to introduce a new insect or plant, you know, you're worried about creating another new problem, so you have to be really, really careful. The USDA has a 10-year process of lots and lots and lots of work that you have to do to show that if you're going to introduce an insect to control spotted lanternfly, that they will not touch any of our native insects, and that's a very arduous process to be able to prove this. But they probably will find something, because there's a group of wasps that tend to really only go for one species or one species. They don't tend to feed on other things. So hopefully but we're about 5 years from that being a reality now. So one way or another, we're sticking it out for another 5 years with no help. So it's gonna be a little bit. Yes?
How about the adaptability of nature?
Well, it takes time. And so the problem is,
Like with the lanternflies and whatnot, I heard that there are some bird species that are starting to eat the lanternflies.
sure, and that might happen. So the whole thing with that is it's really, really hard to predict, because usually most evolutionary processes take thousands of years, not like a few years. But there's some really smart birds like blue jays that are just like, I got this one. You know, they'll figure it out. You know, they did the same thing with gypsy moths. They were like,
Right.
I know how to skin this thing, and nobody else could skin them. You know, so yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens. And every now and then you get lucky, and some native predator or parasite just evolves some trick and can totally handle it. But usually that takes a little bit of time, like hundreds or more years.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe we'll get lucky on this one. Also, I didn't think they were as bad this year as they were last year, right? Did anybody else have that experience? At least in my yard, they were nowhere near as bad as they were the year before, 2 years ago. Yeah.
There's been a great movement for the monarch butterfly population, and in all the literature you see for the common folk, they should be planting milkweed over and over again, and there are environmental organizations that are pushing programs for that. In our township, The Environmental Commission on Earth Day is going to be giving away probably close to 1,000 milkweed seedlings.
Nice.
A local grower has done that grass. He's going to provide it.
Great.
So what's the dangers that we're looking at here?
Well, where the milkweeds are from local?
That's the problem. I
You don't
have no
know, you
idea.
don't know. Well, I mean, they probably are, you know. What species is being grown, do you know?
See, that's the problem. I don't have any of that background knowledge.
Yeah, you find out, let me know, I'd be curious. But, you know, I don't think it's gonna be a problem with milkweeds too much. You know, because most of them are pretty, so there's a very good chance it's swamp milkweed, and most of them are pretty mixed up already, you know, so it's probably not gonna be too bad.
If he's basically it's a one-man operation, he's got a nursery, he would probably know where he got the seed
Yeah.
from, right?
Yeah, it would be great to ask him, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, cool. Yes,
Yeah, Dr. Dan.
how you doing? I didn't even know you were in the audience. Hide back there.
I'm 85 years old, and I got a BS in ornamental horticulture from Rutgers in '59.
Okay.
And I want to thank you for bringing this all together, putting it into one piece.
Great.
Because most of this I had been exposed to, but it was spread out over 4 years and many classes.
Great.
So having you put it all together, I think is great.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It means a lot coming from you. I really appreciate that.
I'd like to add, that's one of our members of the Environmental Commission in West Thetford.
Nice. Well, I was going to say, I know Carl. Yeah, Carl and I have been next to each other in booths doing our different things. So, yeah. Yes.
Kind of an odd question. Is there a minimum area beneath which planting native is kind of immaterial? And if you had a very small backyard and you plant one little clump of swamp milkweed, let's say.
Okay, so that's a great
Now,
question.
Clearly there are some micro wasps that could have enormous population and even a very small area.
So, actually, you came up with a good example. So, you know, Carl said, is it, you know, what if you have a really small population? Or like I lived in Drexel Hill, and it's, you know, urban, and I had this little bastion of native plants that was a quarter acre that was like tons and tons of things. Doug actually almost came to my house because I got a couple of sphinx moths that one he's only seen once before, and I lived in absolutely no wildlife area around me. I didn't have to worry about deer. There was no deer issues. And sometimes insects will find things. And so monarchs are notoriously good at finding even one little tiny milkweed in the sea of not milkweeds. And I don't know how, I mean, I know it's a cardenolide that becomes, you know, aerosol and blah, blah, whatever. But I mean, it's amazing that they can do it. Like the fact that they actually pull it off. So I do think that your little yard matters more than you might think. And then of course the other thing is, actually right now I'm getting involved in an initiative. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it yet. I'm not going to talk about it yet, but I will be talking to you about it soon. A cool thing that we're going to be doing at Rowan to do with maybe connecting little, you know, populations of things in urban and suburban and agricultural areas of just like, hey, you've got these native plants here. This neighbor has this many. This neighbor doesn't, but maybe we could convince them to plant some too, and then we have a bigger, you know, connection of all of those things. So, but yeah, no, it's a great question, because I've had a lot of people say that to me too. Like, if I have one swamp milkweed, does it matter? There are plants for sure it's not going to work. Like, let's say you planted white turtlehead, and you're trying to get Baltimore checker spots. You will never get a Baltimore checker spot if you put 2 plants in your backyard and you live in, you know, wherever, Mullica Hill or something. It's just not going to happen. You know, you would need probably hundreds of plants at a minimum, and if you're lucky, they might find that. Like, and it might take 50 years. So it really depends on what the plant is. It really depends on what the insect is you're trying to attract. But I guess my take on this is, you'd be surprised how well it can work. I mean, I lived in Drexel Hill, and I got all kinds of cool insects, like tons of insects, just in the middle of nowhere, miles from anything. So. Yes.
Can you recommend any resources of how we can find native plants that would be good in our yards? Is there, can you give some recommendations?
So there, yeah, Xerces Society has some great information. I actually have a one-page PDF that I can send to Rich that is just some of my recommendations based on 7 different criteria. And it's like just a one-pager. It's got like 30 different plants on it that are all native to the Mid-Atlantic, and they're all native to South Jersey. You can get many of them in the trade. Some of them are a little harder to get, but if you really want them, tell me, I can probably get it. Yeah, but Xerces Society is a great resource. Xerces Society, by the way, is the Invertebrate Conservation Society. So like monarchs are their flagship species because everybody loves monarchs. I don't know if you all know this, there are some beautiful close relatives of monarchs in other parts of the country, like queens. Has anybody ever heard of a queen butterfly before? They're absolutely beautiful, and they look just like monarchs, except that the spots are a little different, and the color of the wing is a little bit more of a honey color. And but anyway, so whenever I think of these things, I always think about the other closely related species too, that every now and then show up in New Jersey. Probably going to be more commonly. Probably going to get them up here with some regularity in the future, but yeah.
I was going to comment, that was very helpful to know about the leaf coloration change.
Yeah.
I've never heard that. And I'm thinking of another plant, penstemon huckster red.
Yeah.
Penstemon is in the wild, and butterflies like it, and bugs like it. But that huckster red.
It is a really pretty plant, and I know what you're saying, yeah. And so for the pollinators, it probably doesn't matter, right? But it's the things that would feed on the plant. And most of the time when people plant penstemon, it's really to bring in the pollinators.
Right.
So I'm guessing in that particular case, it doesn't matter so much.
Yeah.
But if you can get a wild type penstemon, you know, it would be good to do it. It's probably hard. Yeah.
But I had never heard that. So
Yeah.
that's helpful.
Yes.
There's a tie-in between different plant species. If you were trying to plant a native garden bed, whatever you want to call it, seems to me that you should ideally also try to get all the species from the same kind of plant community.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Reasonable.
Sure,
In other words,
yeah.
You might be able to get painted trillium to grow under oak trees, but it would be kind of anomalous.
Yeah.
But you could perhaps get, as you say, stinking Benjamin or red trillium
Yeah.
under an oak tree.
Yeah.
Try to find, go to a list of plant communities and say, oh, okay, this is what I would find in a natural population of South Jersey messick oak kind of thing.
Yeah.
Would be the
Well, you think
understood.
that way, and you've written a book about this.
Yeah.
So you're taking it to the next level, which I love, which is thinking about not plants as individual things, but as more of a, like, these naturally occur together. When you can do that, the only reason I don't go there is just because it takes another level of knowledge, and so I want to go there, but it's, you know, you're asking a little more of people every time you go up one more level. So that's, but it's, if you're interested, there are books, and also this man has co-authored a book on, what was it called again?
Well, plant communities.
Plant Communities of South Jersey. Yeah. So lots of information there. Cool. I only have time for one more question. Yes.
There is a great resource. It's jerseyyards.org.
Oh yes, I've given a talk to them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful website. It'll ask you where you're located in the state, what kind of growing conditions you have. It has all these drop-down menus to help you do plant selection, and then it also recommends local nurseries that stock those plants.
Yeah, that's a great organization. Thanks for bringing that one up. I've actually given a talk to them before too, and not this talk, but a different talk. And yeah, they're really doing a great job.
Great program.
Oh yeah.